The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered not by a boy on a pony this time, but by a liveried footman in the black and silver of the House of Calloway, who rode into the village of Ashford with an air of a man performing a funeral rite rather than an errand. He did not dismount. He handed the folded paper down to the first villager who approached him, a baker's apprentice, flour still dusting his sleeves, and rode away again without a single word, as though the village itself was something he preferred not to breathe the air of any longer than necessary. By noon, the letter had passed through every hand in Ashford, and by evening it had brought the entire village to a standstill of quiet, disbelieving dread. It came from the Duke of Calloway, Lord Edmund Calloway, who held the charter to Ashford's Market Square, as he held nearly everything else of consequence within 20 miles. The mill, the tolls upon the river bridge, the very ground beneath the cottages in which the villagers had lived for generations. And the letter, written in a hand as cold and precise as the man who had dictated it, declared, in language that permitted no appeal, that the market charter of Ashford was to be revoked at the close of the month. That villagers finished, the Duke was heard to have said to his steward, not troubling to lower his voice, as the letter was sealed and sent, "Let it wither, and let the land revert to better use." She did not yet understand, on that Tuesday morning, that she would be the one to prove him wrong. Before this story carries you further into the fog and the fear that settled over Ashford that autumn, allow one small request. If tales of quiet women outlasting the powerful men who underestimate them are the sort of story that keeps your evenings company, then consider pressing that subscribe button now, so this channel does not slip past you unnoticed, and tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is no small thing to imagine so many different corners of the earth listening to the same old English market square come back to life. Now, let us return to Ashford and to the letter that would change everything. The market of Ashford had stood, by the reckoning of the parish records, for well over 2 centuries, a modest square of cobbled stone at the village's heart, ringed by low stone buildings that had, across the generations, housed everything from a wool merchant's warehouse to a magistrate's court to, in more recent and humbler decades, little more than a scattering of stalls where farmers from the surrounding country brought their produce twice weekly to trade. It was not a grand market. It had never rivaled the county town's Saturday fair, nor the great cattle markets held further north. But it had been, for as long as anyone in Ashford could remember, the beating heart of the village's survival, the place where a farmer's wife sold her butter and eggs for enough coin to see her family through the winter, where a widow might earn a modest living selling ribbons and thread, where the whole scattered community of Ashford gathered, twice each week, and remembered that it was, in fact, a community, and not merely a collection of struggling households scattered across the Duke's land. To close it, to revoke, with the stroke of a pen, a charter that had outlived kings, was not merely an inconvenience to the Duke of Calloway. It was, to every soul in Ashford, very nearly a death sentence. No one in the village dared ask, openly, why the Duke had chosen this particular autumn to deliver such a blow, though there was no shortage of quiet speculation whispered over garden walls and across the low stone bridge. Some said it was simple economy, that the Duke, whose own estate had grown quietly strained beneath debts few outside his own study fully understood, wished to consolidate the market square's ground into something that might be sold or leased for greater profit. Others murmured darker theories still, of an old grievance between the House of Calloway and a family long vanished from Ashford's living memory. A grievance that had, perhaps, waited generations for its final settling. She did not yet understand which of these rumours, if any, held the truth. She would understand, in time, that the truth was stranger and more deliberately buried than any rumour the village had ever dared imagine. It was into this village, reeling from its death sentence, that Miss Charlotte Fairweather returned in the last week of that same autumn, not as a stranger, for she had been born in Ashford and had spent the whole of her childhood beneath its low stone roofs, but as a woman changed by circumstances she had never asked for, and would not, for the whole of her life, entirely recover from. She was 22, though grief and hardship had aged something in her bearing beyond her years, not her face, which retained still the soft, graceful lines of a young woman, but something quieter, in the set of her shoulders and the careful measuring way her eyes took in a room before she permitted herself to speak. She had left Ashford 5 years before, when her father, a modest gentleman of the parish with a small independent income, had accepted a position as land agent upon a distant estate in the north. Taking his wife and daughter with him, in pursuit of a fortune that estate had never, in the end, delivered, her father had died the previous spring, not peacefully. As Eleanor Hartley's father had died in another county's quiet telling, but suddenly, thrown from a horse on a rain-slick road, leaving behind a modest income that proved, upon the settling of his affairs, to be considerably less modest a debt than anyone had suspected. Her mother, already frail, did not long survive the shock and the scandal of it, for scandal there was, when it emerged that Charlotte's father had, in his final desperate years, borrowed heavily against an inheritance that did not, strictly speaking, exist, and had died owing sums to men considerably less patient than the family's few remaining friends. Charlotte buried her mother in the cold, unfamiliar churchyard of a northern parish scarcely 4 months after burying her father, and found herself, at 22, entirely alone in the world, with a name suddenly whispered in connection with debt and disgrace, and nowhere left to go but back to the one place that had ever truly felt like home. She did not yet understand, boarding the coach south with the last of her possessions in a single worn trunk, that Ashford itself was dying, that the village she remembered from her childhood, alive with market day bustle and the particular warm chaos of stallholders calling their wares across the cobbled square, would greet her instead with a silence heavier than any grief she had yet endured. The village she found, when the coach finally set her down at its edge, was not the village of her memory. The cottages stood much as she remembered them, low and grey beneath their thatch, but the life that had once animated the streets between them seemed to have drained away, leaving behind only a kind of held breath, a waiting stillness, as though the whole village had gathered itself for a blow it did not yet know how to survive. She learned of the Duke's letter within an hour of her arrival from the same baker's apprentice who had first received it, now grown into a young man with worry etched prematurely into his brow. She learned, too, in the days that followed, precisely how thoroughly Ashford's fortunes had become entangled with the market's survival, how the closure of the charter would mean not merely the loss of a twice-weekly gathering, but the collapse of the only trade many families had left. In a village where the mill's tolls and the bridge's tolls and the very rent upon the cottages already flowed, each quarter, into the Duke of Calloway's already considerable coffers. She did not yet understand why a man of such wealth and consequence would trouble himself to strip away the last modest livelihood of a village that could offer him, by any reasonable calculation, so very little in return. It was a question that would occupy her thoughts through the long, cold weeks that followed, weeks in which grief for her parents and fear for the only home she had left tangled together into something she could not always separate. Weeps taken alone at night in the small rented room above the shuttered draper's shop where she had found lodging. Resolve gathered each morning anew as she rose to face a village that seemed, day by day, to grow quieter still. It was in her second week home, walking the empty market square in the grey light of a November morning, that Charlotte first encountered the man who would, in time, become both her fiercest obstacle and her most unexpected ally. Lord Edmund Calloway, Duke of Calloway, was riding the boundary of his land that morning with his steward, and he drew his horse to a halt at the market square's edge with the particular unhurried authority of a man for whom the whole world existed, more or less, to arrange itself around his convenience. He was not, Charlotte noted with the same feint, unwilling surprise Eleanor Hartley had once felt in a different county's cold study, an unhandsome man. He carried perhaps 40 years, with the kind of severe, weathered dignity that made him seem both older and more formidable than his years alone might suggest. His dark hair touched with grey at the temples, his eyes are flat, assessing grey that missed. She would come to learn very little indeed. He recognized her name when she gave it, with a flicker of something she could not quite read. Recognition, certainly, but also, briefly, something that might almost have been unease, gone so quickly she wondered afterward if she had imagined it entirely. "Miss Fairweather," he said, in a voice as cold and precise as his letter had been. "I had heard the family return to the parish. My condolences on your losses." The words were correct. They carried no warmth whatsoever. She asked him, with a composure she did not entirely feel, whether the rumours of the market's closure held any truth. He did not soften the blow, nor did he trouble himself to explain it at any length. The charter, he informed her, was an old inefficiency, granted by a distant Callaway ancestor to a village that no longer justified the ground it occupied. The market produced negligible income, drew negligible custom beyond the immediate parish, and Ashford, whatever sentiment its residents attached to it, was, in the cold arithmetic of his estate's accounts, finished as a place of any commercial consequence. "That village is finished," he said again, more directly this time, as though repeating the sentiment aloud settled the matter beyond further discussion, and he turned his horse to continue his ride without waiting for whatever reply she might have offered. She stood a long while in the empty square after he had gone, the cold wind pulling at her cloak, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but a strange, steady mixture of both. The same quiet, unyielding resolve, though she did not yet know it, that had once carried another woman in another county through the ruin of a worthless lake. She did not yet understand how she intended to save a market the Duke himself had declared beyond saving, but she understood, standing alone in that empty square, that she did not intend to leave Ashford to wither without at least attempting to prove him wrong. The path toward that proof began, as such paths so often do in stories preserved in the quiet memory of old English villages, with a locked door. The building at the northeastern corner of the market square, a narrow stone structure that had once housed, according to the oldest villager's memory, the market's official records and the office of whatever official had, in centuries past, overseen its charter and its tolls, had stood shuttered and locked for as long as anyone could recall. The key, it was generally understood, had long ago passed into the Callaway family's keeping, along with so much else in the parish, and no one in living memory had troubled to ask after it, for no one in living memory had possessed any particular reason to. Charlotte possessed a reason now. She found, through the kindness of the elderly parish clerk, a Mr. Aldous Pruitt, who had served the village in one modest official capacity or another for the better part of 5 decades, that a secondary key had in fact never left Ashford at all. It had passed instead, generations before, into the keeping of the church, filed away among a great many other keys and deeds and records that no one had troubled to sort through since before Mr. Pruitt's own father had held the clerk's position. It took her the better part of 3 days, working by candlelight in the church's cold and dust-thick record room, to find it, a small iron key, tied with a faded ribbon to a scrap of parchment bearing, in a hand grown faint with age, the single word, market. No one in the church had spoken of that key in longer than Mr. Pruitt could say. What remained hidden behind the door it opened would prove far more dangerous and far more valuable than a simple abandoned records office had any right to be. The room within, when at last she turned the key in a lockstiff with decades of disuse, smelled of dust and damp stone and the particular mustiness of paper left too long without air. Shelves lined every wall, sagging beneath ledgers and rolled documents and boxes tied with string gone brittle with age, and Charlotte stood at the threshold for a long moment, candle in hand, feeling the peculiar weight of a room that had waited, patiently, for someone to finally return. She did not yet understand what she was searching for. She knew only that a market charter old enough to have outlived kings must surely have left behind, somewhere within this forgotten room, some record of what it had once been worth, and what it might, perhaps, be worth again. The ledgers she found across the following weeks told a story the Duke's cold arithmetic had conveniently omitted. Ashfen's market, she learned, poring by candlelight over pages brittle with age, had not always been the modest, twice-weekly gathering of her own living memory. In an earlier century, before a long, slow decline that the ledgers traced across nearly 100 years of gradually shrinking entries, the market had held a chartered right, granted the earliest ledger recorded, by royal patent rather than merely by the goodwill of whichever Callaway ancestor happened to hold the surrounding land, to host not merely local produce, but a quarterly trade fair of considerable regional significance, drawing merchants and buyers from 3 counties and generating tolls and fees that had once rivaled, in their heyday, the income of the county town's own celebrated Saturday market. What remained hidden, buried deeper still within the ledger's careful, patient record, was the reason for that decline. She found it in a set of correspondence, folded within the pages of the oldest ledger, between a Callaway ancestor of some 4 generations past and the very officials responsible for renewing the market's charter each decade. The letters revealed, in language that grew progressively less guarded across their span, a deliberate campaign, begun not by circumstance or misfortune. As the village had long assumed, but by calculated design, to redirect the region's trade away from Ashford and toward a new market the Callaway family had, in that same period, established upon land considerably closer to their own estate and considerably more profitable to their own direct interests. Ashford's ancient charter had not simply faded through the slow, natural decline of an unfortunate village. It had been deliberately starved, its trade routes quietly redirected, its merchants gradually discouraged through tolls and inconveniences imposed with careful, deniable precision, until the once thriving quarterly fair shrank, across a single Callaway generation's careful management, into the modest twice-weekly gathering of farmers' wives selling butter and eggs that Charlotte had known throughout her own childhood. She did not yet understand, in that first candlelit discovery, precisely why a family already so wealthy would trouble itself to so deliberately impoverish a village already so modest. She would understand it fully only weeks later, when a second and far more troubling set of documents surfaced from beneath the false bottom of an old strongbox at the very back of the records room. Documents that connected the market's ancient decline directly and disturbingly to the current Duke's own far more urgent and far more private financial troubles. There was, too, in those weeks of careful searching, the matter of the steward's strange behaviour. Mr. Josiah Renfrew, who had served as the Duke's steward for a great many years and who oversaw, among his considerable other duties, the collection of the village's various rents and tolls, took a sudden and pointed interest in Charlotte's visits to the old records room almost as soon as they began. He appeared at the church with unusual frequency that winter, inquiring after her progress with a solicitousness that sat uneasily beside the sharp, assessing quality of his questions, and Mr. Tarley's. Pruitt, the elderly clerk, confided to Charlotte in a lowered voice that Renfrew had, some years before, made a similar inquiry into the old market records himself, though he had left, on that occasion, considerably more abruptly than he had arrived, and had never spoken of the matter again. She did not yet understand what Renfrew feared she might uncover. She understood only that his unease, each time she mentioned some new discovery among the ledgers, seemed to grow rather than diminish, a pattern that told her, more clearly than any direct confrontation could have, that she was drawing steadily nearer to something the House of Callaway had worked very hard indeed to keep buried. There was also, threading quietly through those winter weeks, the matter of Lady Beatrice Calloway. The Duke's widowed aunt, a woman of some 70 years, who had lived at the great house for the whole of her long widowhood, and who was regarded, by most of the county, as a somewhat eccentric fixture of little real consequence, took a curious and unexpected interest in Charlotte's presence at the old market square. She appeared there one grey afternoon in her own modest carriage, unaccompanied by any servant, and spoke to Charlotte with a directness that startled her, asking pointed questions about what, precisely, she had found among the old records, and offering, before she departed, a single cryptic piece of advice: that Charlotte ought to look, if she truly wished to understand the market's fate, not merely at the ledgers of a century past, but at the accounts of the present one. No one in the great house spoke openly of Lady Beatrice's own history, though Charlotte gathered, from careful and patient inquiry among the older villagers, that she had once, many decades before, taken a keen and unusual interest in trade and commerce for a lady of her station, an interest her own family had, by all accounts, discouraged rather firmly, before her marriage into the Calloway line had settled the matter beyond further argument. She did not yet understand what Lady Beatrice knew, nor why a woman so thoroughly bound to the Calloway name would offer even the smallest hint to a young woman working, quite openly, against the current Duke's declared intentions. She would understand it only much later, when the full truth of the market's history and the Duke's present troubles finally emerged into the light. There was, alongside these discoveries, the strange matter of the market cross. At the very centre of the square stood a weathered stone cross, worn nearly smooth by centuries of weather and touch, which the villagers had always regarded as little more than an old landmark, useful chiefly as a meeting point on market days long past. Charlotte, cross-referencing the oldest ledger's careful diagrams of the square's original layout, discovered that the cross had once marked not merely the centre of the market, but the precise boundary point named in the original royal patent itself, the physical proof, set in stone and untouched by any Calloway steward's later manoeuvring. That the market's rights extended considerably further across the parish than the modest, shrunken footprint it had occupied within her own living memory. She spent an entire bitter week, wrapped against the cold in every shawl she owned, tracing the old boundary markers the ledger described, several of them buried now beneath decades of overgrown hedgerow or half swallowed by the expansion of a neighbouring farmer's field. Mr. Pruitt walked with her on several of these expeditions, his old knees protesting the distances, but his memory, once properly prompted by the sight of a half-buried stone, proving sharper than either of them had expected, for he recalled, dimly, his own father once mentioning boundary stones the old Duke's men had been glad enough to let the grass grow over. Each stone she uncovered was a fragment of proof that could not be argued away by any modern steward's convenient arithmetic. Each one drew Renfrew's visits to the church a little more frequent, his questions a little more pointed, his composure, each time she calmly answered them, a little more visibly strained. There was, too, the peculiar silence of the miller. Old Mr. Dunstan, who had operated Ashford's mill for the better part of 40 years, and whose family had held the position for generations before him, proved oddly reluctant to discuss the market's history at all, deflecting Charlotte's careful questions with a haste that seemed, to her increasingly practised eye, considerably more deliberate than simple disinterest. It was not until the deepest weeks of winter, when Charlotte happened to mention, in the course of an otherwise ordinary conversation, the discovery of the canal scheme correspondence among the Duke's own private troubles, that Dunstan's guarded manner finally cracked. His own father, he admitted at last, seated by his hearth with a reluctance that seemed to cost him some real effort to overcome, had been offered a considerable sum some 30 years before to quietly certify that the mill's own toll records showed the market's trade in permanent and irreversible decline, a certification the elder Dunstan had provided, believing at the time that he did the village no particular harm, since the decline, so far as he could tell, was real enough on its face. He had not known, nor troubled himself to ask, why the Calloway estate had wanted such a certification committed so formally to paper, nor what use it might later serve in justifying a closure the family had, even then, perhaps already begun quietly planning. It was one more thread woven into the pattern Charlotte was assembling, piece by careful piece, in the cold records room. Proof not merely that the market had declined, but that its decline had been documented, certified, and filed away for future use. Decades before any current Duke's Canal debts had made that future use so urgently necessary. The market square standing empty in frost rhymed beneath a sky heavy with the promise of snow, and Charlotte, working now not merely from curiosity, but from a growing and deliberate purpose, began to understand that restoring the market's ancient charter would require considerably more than proving its historical worth. It would require capital she did not possess, merchants who had long since forgotten Ashford existed, and, most difficult of all, some means of overcoming a duke who had already, quite publicly, declared the village finished. She found her first true ally not among the great families of the county, but among the very farmers and stallholders whose livelihoods the market's closure most directly threatened. She called a meeting in the last week before Christmas in the modest hall behind the parish church and spoke to a gathering of some 30 villagers, farmers' wives and small tradesmen, a miller's son, the baker whose apprentice had first received the fateful letter, of what she had found among the old ledgers, and of what she believed, with a conviction that surprised even herself as she spoke it aloud, the market might yet become again. She did not promise them an easy restoration. She promised them only that she believed the Charter's ancient rights, properly understood and properly pursued, might yet be reclaimed, not through the Duke's goodwill, which she held no illusions of receiving, but through the older, stronger authority of a royal patent that no mere estate steward's arithmetic could simply overrule. The villagers, weary and frightened as they were, did not receive this proposal with immediate enthusiasm. Fear, she was learning, is a slower thing to overturn than hope is to kindle, and it was not until Mr. Pruitt himself rose, in that cold hall, to confirm the authenticity of what she had found, that the gathering's uncertain murmur began, slowly, to shift towards something that might, with careful tending, grow into resolve. Before this story carries you into what came next, into the confrontation that would finally test both Charlotte's resolve and the Duke's own carefully guarded secrets, allow one more small request. If Ashford's fight to reclaim its market has earned even a small place in your evening, then let that subscribe button be the thing you press before the next chapter begins, so you do not lose this channel among so many others. And do tell us, below, whether you believe Lady Beatrice will prove friend or complication before this story's end. Some of you, I suspect, already have your guesses. The document that finally broke the matter open arrived not through Charlotte's own searching, but through Lady Beatrice Calloway herself, who appeared once more at the Old Market Square on a bitter January afternoon, snow beginning to fall in slow, deliberate flakes across the empty cobblestones, and pressed into Charlotte's hands a small bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, saying only, before she turned back toward her waiting carriage, that some debts owed to the truth outlast even the longest silence. The papers were the current Duke's own private financial records, copied, Charlotte would later learn, by Lady Beatrice's own hand from documents she had encountered, quite by chance, during the settling of her late husband's estate some years before, and kept ever since against a day she had perhaps always suspected might come. They revealed what Renfrew's uneasy visits and the ledger's careful century-old correspondence had only hinted at. The Duke of Calloway's estate, for all its outward grandeur, carried debts of considerable and growing severity, accumulated not through any fault of his own immediate management, but inherited from his late father's disastrous investment in a canal scheme that had collapsed some 15 years before, and compounded in the years since by mortgages taken quietly against nearly every parcel of land the family held, including, Charlotte read with a jolt that stilled her breath entirely, the very ground beneath Ashford's Market Square. The revocation of the market charter, she understood now with sudden and complete clarity, had nothing whatsoever to do with the village's modest income, nor with any genuine belief that Ashford was, as the Duke had so coldly declared, finished. It had everything to do with a mortgage due for renewal within the month, and a lender who required, as a condition of extending it further, that the Market Square's ground be cleared of any outstanding charter or claim that might complicate its use as collateral. The Duke of Calloway was not, as the village had assumed, discarding a worthless inconvenience. He was quietly, desperately, mortgaging away the very heart of Ashford to save the rest of his own estate from collapse, and doing so, moreover, in a manner that would leave the village with nothing at all, while his own family's name and holdings remained, to the outward eye of the county, entirely intact. What remained hidden, connecting every earlier clue Charlotte had gathered across those long winter weeks, was now laid bare with an emotional weight that struck her far harder than she had anticipated. The century-old correspondence that had first redirected Ashford's trade away from its own ancient fare, that same deliberate pattern of quiet, deniable strangulation, repeated now by a descendant facing his own private ruin. Renfrew's uneasy visits, explained at last by a steward who understood precisely what his master stood to lose should the old charter's true worth ever come fully to light. Lady Beatrice's own carefully guarded silence, broken only now, explained by a woman who had watched this same family pattern of quiet cruelty play out across her own long lifetime, and who had, perhaps, waited 70 years for someone with the courage to finally challenge it. Charlotte sat a long while in the cold records room that evening, the Duke's private papers spread before her in the candlelight, and felt something she had not expected to feel amid the anger and vindication such a discovery might reasonably have produced. A strange, unwilling flicker of understanding, even sympathy, for a man who had inherited debts not of his own making, and who had chosen, faced with his family's ruin, the same cold and expedient cruelty his ancestors had practiced before him, rather than the harder, more honest path of confronting the truth openly. She did not yet know whether that understanding would soften what she intended to do next, or merely sharpen her resolve to see it done properly, and with as much fairness as the circumstances allowed. She confronted the Duke directly on a morning in early February, snow still lying thick across the market square's cobblestones, and this time it was she who did not wait to be received before speaking, laying before him, in the same cold study at Calloway House, where he had once so coldly informed her of his intentions, both the ancient royal patent establishing Ashford's market rights beyond any mere estate steward's power to simply revoke, and, set down before him, with a steadiness that cost her more composure than she allowed herself to show, his own private financial papers, copied in his aunt's careful hand. He did not deny what the papers revealed. Denial, she was coming to understand, was rarely the first instinct of men whose whole authority rested upon never appearing to need it. But confronted with proof so thoroughly assembled, he abandoned it more quickly than his cold reputation might have suggested he would, admitting, in a voice that carried, for the first time in her acquaintance with him, something that might almost have been weariness rather than command, that the canal debts had indeed brought his family nearer to ruin than any outward appearance of the estate had ever betrayed, and that the market square's clearance had been, precisely as she suspected, a desperate measure taken to satisfy a lender's demands before the true scale of the family's troubles became public knowledge. What he had not anticipated, what perhaps no Calloway before him had ever anticipated, so accustomed had the family grown to simply overwhelming any obstacle Ashford's modest resistance might raise, was the alternative Charlotte had spent those long winter weeks quietly preparing. The ancient charter, once properly reasserted, did not merely protect the market square from clearance. It restored, in full legal weight, rights that had lain dormant but never entirely extinguished for the better part of a century. Rights to host, once again, a quarterly trade fair of the scale the earliest ledgers described. Rights that, properly pursued, might generate tolls and fees considerably exceeding whatever modest sum the mortgage ground alone could ever have fetched. She proposed, in that cold February study, not a battle the Duke could not afford to lose, but a partnership he could not afford to refuse. The market's ancient rights restored and actively developed, its tolls and fees split by agreement between the village's own newly formed trading council and the estate's desperately needed revenue, in an arrangement that would, within a single season's proper management, generate income considerably exceeding what the mortgage ground's outright sale could ever have produced. The Duke of Callaway was, whatever else his family's long history of quiet cruelty had made of him, no fool where arithmetic was concerned, and he recognized, studying the careful figures Charlotte laid before him. Drawn from the very ledgers his own ancestors had once used to strangle the market's ancient prosperity, that she offered him something considerably more valuable than the desperate, one-time sale he had originally intended. He did not accept immediately. Pride, even faced with such plain advantage, is rarely so easily set aside, but within the fortnight, papers were drawn reversing the charter's revocation, and by early spring, word had begun to travel, carried by merchants Charlotte herself had written to, drawing upon contacts her own father's northern connections had, in one of the few useful legacies of his difficult final years, left her, that Ashford's ancient quarterly fair would reopen that summer. Its rights restored, its ancient royal patent once again standing between the village and any future lord's careless arithmetic. The spring that followed tested Charlotte's resolve nearly as thoroughly as the long winter's searching had. Renfrew, whose unease had never fully settled, even after the Duke's own acceptance of the new arrangement, made one final and nearly disastrous attempt to undermine the fair's reopening, quietly discouraging several of the merchants Charlotte had written to, through letters written in the Duke's name, but without his knowledge, warning of unstable local conditions and unreliable tolls, hoping to see the whole revival collapse before it could properly begin, and thereby restore. Through failure rather than confrontation, the mortgage arrangement he had so carefully helped construct. It was Lady Beatrice, once again, who uncovered the scheme, recognizing in a merchant's puzzled inquiry a turn of phrase too closely echoing Renfrew's own habitual caution to be coincidence, and it was the Duke himself, confronted with proof of his own steward's quiet betrayal, who dismissed Renfrew from his long service with a swiftness that surprised the whole county, and who rode personally, in the weeks that followed, to several of the merchants in question, to assure them in his own hand and his own voice that Ashford's revival carried his family's full and genuine support. By midsummer, the market square that had stood silent and frost rhymed through the whole of that long, difficult winter, rang instead with a bustle it had not known in 100 years. Merchants from 3 counties setting up stalls beneath awnings bright against the summer sky, farmers' wives selling not merely butter and eggs, but wool and honey and preserves to buyers who had travelled considerable distances on the strength of the old charter's restored reputation. The narrow stone building at the square's northeastern corner reopened now, not as a forgotten records room, but as the proper office of a trading council Charlotte herself had been asked, by unanimous and grateful vote, to chair. By the following autumn, the accounts kept jointly between the village council and the Callaway estate told a story that even the county's most sceptical old families found impossible to dismiss. Ashford's restored quarterly fair, in its very first full season, had generated tolls and fees exceeding, by a margin substantial enough to silence even the most stubborn doubters, the income the Duke's own remaining estate holdings produced across that same period. A village the Duke himself had once declared entirely finished, grown, within a single year, considerably wealthier in its own modest right than the very estate that had so nearly consumed it. She thought, standing in the summer evening light, of the letter that had arrived that Tuesday morning so many months before, of the baker's apprentice handing it to her, with flour still dusting his sleeves, of the held-breath silence that had gripped the whole village in its wake, and she found she could scarcely reconcile that frightened stillness with the market square alive now before her. The calling of stallholders, the laughter of children weaving between the stalls, the particular warm chaos of a community that had, against every cold arithmetic a powerful man had once pronounced upon it, refused to accept its own ending. She thought, too, of her parents, buried in that unfamiliar northern churchyard, and felt, for the first time since their deaths, a grief that had softened into something gentler than sorrow, a quiet gratitude that whatever her father's final years had cost her, they had not cost her the courage to search patiently through a locked and dusty room for a truth others had long since stopped believing existed. She had built nothing from inheritance. She had built it, instead, from stubborn attention paid to what everyone else had agreed to forget, and from a refusal to let a single man's careless declaration stand as the final word on a village's worth. Misty Pruitt, considerably livelier now than the stooped and careful clerk who had first led her to the church's forgotten record room, found her there at the market cross as the light faded, and remarked, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 50 quiet years in service to a parish he loved, that he had never in all his days expected to see the old boundary stones uncovered and honoured again within his own lifetime. Charlotte told him, and meant it entirely, that she had not truly expected it either, only hoped for it, in the coldest and most frightening weeks of that long winter, with a persistence she had not always been certain she could sustain. The Duke found her there as well, as the last light slipped below the western hedgerows, and though the story does not record every word that passed between them in that particular quiet hour by the old stone cross, it records enough to know that Ashford's market, once declared finished by a man too burdened by his own inherited troubles to see its true worth, had become instead the instrument through which both a village and a family finally set down the long, quiet cruelties they had each, in their different ways, been carrying. He visited the market often in the seasons that followed, and if the county noticed how much more frequently his visits fell than the partnership's business strictly required, and how much less coldly he now spoke, in company, of the young woman whose patience searching through a locked and forgotten room had saved both a village and, in its own quieter way, his family's own faltering fortunes. They were, for the most part, too well accustomed by now to Ashford's remarkable turn of fortune to remark upon it with any real surprise. What passed between Charlotte and the Duke in the seasons that followed was not swift nor easily sentimental, for both had been shaped too thoroughly by loss and by a long history of quiet family cruelty to embrace such simple resolution. It was instead a slow and careful thing, built first upon the shared, practical labour of the market's continued growth, and only gradually, across long conversations held in the Trading Council's modest new office, or walked along the river path where the old bridge tolls had once flowed so entirely into a single family's private coffers, into something warmer and considerably more honest than either had believed themselves still capable of feeling. Misty, Dunstan the miller too, found a quiet peace in the market's revival that he had not expected to feel. He came to Charlotte one afternoon that autumn, hat in hand, and told her, with the particular halting sincerity of a man unaccustomed to apology, that he regretted the silence he had kept through her long weeks of searching, and that he intended, going forward, to keep the mill's records open to the Trading Council exactly as the ancient charter had once required, so that no future steward might ever again quietly bury an inconvenient truth beneath a miller's obliging signature. Charlotte thanked him and asked nothing further of the matter, for she had learned, across that long and difficult winter, that some debts were better resolved through changed behaviour than through prolonged reproach. She thought often, in the years that followed, of the locked door at the records room's threshold, and of the strange, patient wait she had felt standing before it that first afternoon, candle in hand, uncertain whether anything worth finding lay beyond it at all. She had not known then that a village's whole future rested behind that door, nor that a family's long-buried cruelty and a duke's own private desperation would unravel together from the same brittle, dust-covered pages. She knew only that she had refused to leave the door locked simply because everyone else had long since stopped believing it worth opening, and it was that refusal, more than any single discovery within, that she came to regard as the true beginning of Ashford's revival. Lady Beatrice, in the years that followed, took to visiting the market square on fair days with an openness she had denied herself for the better part of 70 years, and spoke often to any villager curious enough to ask. Of the particular satisfaction of watching a wrong so long buried finally set right by a woman with the patience to uncover it properly, rather than simply raging against it in the moment of its discovery. Charlotte Fairweather never again heard her family's name spoken in the hushed, pitying tones that had greeted her return to Ashford that difficult autumn. She heard it instead spoken, across the county and beyond it, with the particular respect reserved for those who rebuild rather than merely survive, a respect earned not through inheritance, nor through any charity extended to a grieving orphan, but through patient, unglamorous labour in a cold and dusty records room, and through a refusal to accept that a village declared finished by the powerful must remain, forever, exactly as finished as their careless words had proclaimed it. And on quiet evenings, long after the market's restored prosperity had become simply and comfortably a settled part of Ashford's ordinary life, visitors walking the cobbled square at dusk would sometimes pause before the small plaque the Trading Council had mounted upon the old records room's door, commemorating the charter's restoration. And they would look out across a market square alive still with the particular warm chaos of a community remembering, twice each week, that it was indeed a community, and they would understand, whether or not the plaque's brief words ever fully explained it to them, that they stood upon ground preserved in the quiet, patient memory of an old English village, saved not by grand rescue, but by one woman's refusal to accept another man's careless declaration as the final word on what her home was worth.